Everybody. Nice to see you all. And I'll also, Hani, I'll also monitor the chat box, and I'm an old hand at Zoom now, so I can probably intercept those questions as they come. But if I miss them, go ahead and interrupt me. I'm happy to be interrupted.
Okay.
I'm a faculty member in the Department of City and Regional Planning. My own work is much more focused on sort of policy issues, institutional issues, and also travel behavior and location decisions. So the work I'm presenting here is something that I did jointly with a doctoral student, Marcel Moran, and it was a study funded by the Institute for Transportation Studies here at UC Berkeley, which is why you see that little logo there. And we did the work primarily in 2018, 2019. So this is a fast moving field. To some extent, what we've done is not quite up to date in terms of what cities are doing now. But generally what I'm trying to do here with this work is sort of categorize the sorts of things that cities are doing in response to the advent of autonomous vehicles, ground-based autonomous vehicles. And then I want to talk briefly, kind of opine briefly about the behavioral implications of these policy decisions as they're being made, because they can influence the extent to which people use AVs, the travel behavior that results from the introduction of autonomous vehicles. So AVs are being tested in a growing number of US states and cities, and a number of different agencies have the potential to respond to this. These include cities and counties, municipalities. So I've put cities in my title, but really we're also talking about states, transit agencies, and regional agencies, all of which have the potential to respond in some way to the advent of autonomous vehicles. And as I'm sure you've already been discussing in some of your previous sessions, but since I'm the first in this week, I'll just mention this. There's really a great deal of variability in terms of predictions as to the short and long-term effects of autonomous vehicles. There are people who believe that there'll be a reduction in crashes, a reduction in related fatalities, that there will be improved mobility options for people with disabilities. There are predictions that there will be increased congestion, decreased transit ridership, and the predictions run the gamut in terms of the magnitude of these potential changes. This presents a lot of challenges for planners. The fact that there isn't a ton of consensus about what will happen or how it will happen or how it ought to happen means that municipal planners, city planners are operating really kind of on their own. They're looking to each other to see to what extent there is some sort of consensus about what ought to be done. And this is certainly a big challenge for planning. Now, there's a wide range of issues around autonomous vehicles, and these go beyond the ones I've mentioned, including safety and labor issues. And I'm not going to be able to address all those today, but I'll address some of them. So this is the outline of the talk. We'll introduce the project, talk about research methods a bit, and then there's two sets of findings. One of them is talking about the testing of autonomous vehicles, which is happening now, and pilots, which are also happening. In fact, there are some services being rolled out now. And then, in some sense, the more interesting question to me anyway is longer term policies around autonomous vehicles. And then I'll sort of do a bit of a conclusion. So to date, there's been a ton of research on autonomous vehicles. A lot of it has been in the gray literature area. There have been a lot of reports. It's been pretty speculative, obviously, because the technology has yet to be widely adopted. And I'm referring to previous research on autonomous vehicles that is focused specifically on the policy side. That's focused specifically on, what ought to be done, how cities ought to be responding, what sort of plans ought to be made. So these are sort of pictures of a bunch of reports. The two research questions that we addressed in this study were, first of all, what are cities, regions, and transit agencies doing right now to direct, to influence, or to react to A/B testing and initial passenger pilots within their boundaries? So this is an interesting question because it is immediate. It's actually happening. And then the question of what broader policies cities are crafting in order to respond to the advent of autonomous vehicles. So the research methods we used in the project were, first of all, a bunch of document review, federal, state, and local policies regarding autonomous vehicles. This screen on the left shows a picture of the federal AV START Act, which is not yet passed, but which has been discussed. It's a sort of a federal preemption of what states and municipalities are allowed to do with respect to directing autonomous vehicle policy. The central image is the last page of an executive order passed in the state of Arizona, and states have turned out to be the level at which a lot of power has been essentially taken to regulate autonomous vehicles, which I'll come back to. And then finally, on the right side, you see the landing page for the city of Boston's approach to autonomous vehicles. And the state of Massachusetts is a little bit different than other states because, in fact, in that state, municipalities have been given much broader control over autonomous vehicles than in most of the rest of the United States. So the cases that these are sort of some pictures of the different cases that we went into more detail on in this research project. Arlington, Texas, Phoenix, Arizona, Las Vegas, Boston, as well as New York. We looked at Cambridge in Boston as well. And then San Francisco, San Jose, Palo Alto, and Mountain View. So, and all of these cities had different levels of autonomy, sort of the presence of autonomous vehicles, the presence of testing and pilots, and different sort of levels of state intervention as well. So we conducted a bunch of interviews as part of the case studies, and this just gives you a sense of the different organizations. We did in-person interviews in California, Nevada, Arizona, New York, Massachusetts, and Texas. Spoke with staff at municipalities, at metropolitan planning organizations, at transit agencies, at state departments of transportation, and also we spoke with a number of AV firms, including Autonomy, Drive.ai, and Cruise. So this gives you a sense of what we did in terms of interviews. And with qualitative research, there's a set of methods that one is supposed to follow, and it involves coming up with an interview protocol and having a set of questions that is essentially a topic guide, which is meant to guide a conversation with people. So these are the sorts of questions that we asked. Why plan for autonomous vehicles? How does autonomous vehicle planning relate to your city's experience with services like Uber and Lyft? This was a big topic that came up quite a bit. And how do unknowns about technology and adoption rates affect planning for autonomous vehicles? We conducted the majority of interviews in person, although we did 3 over the telephone. We recorded the interviews, we transcribed them, we used various analysis methods to look at the transcripts. And mainly what we did is we just tried to have a conversation with people that lasted about an hour, sometimes longer. If we were in person, we would sometimes be talking to people for quite a long time and seeing what they were doing and going out and doing a little bit of things in the field as well. So here are the findings. First of all, part 1 is about AV testing and pilots. And there are 3 categories of AV testing and pilots. This is kind of working definitions of testing versus pilots. By the way, testing is when you operate vehicles and you're trying to make them work. Sensor calibration, build accurate maps, test the overall performance, all that sort of stuff. And if you're like me and you live in the Bay Area, I'm not sure if anyone here is, we see this happening on our roads all the time. We see the vehicles out there being tested. They're not offering services. Pilots are the initial movement of passengers or goods and freight in vehicles. And there are pilots out there as well. We're not going to talk so much about freight today. There are 3 kinds of things that we were looking at. Public autonomous shuttles, meaning public agencies operating shuttles in some kind of limited fashion, typically. I'll give you some examples soon. Private autonomous vehicle passenger services, which have been offered particularly in Arizona, and freight deliveries. Those are the 3 kinds that we looked at. You can see different images of each of these here. We've got an autonomous shuttle on the top there. That's the Ollie shuttle. We've got the Lyft services offered in Las Vegas. I don't know if anyone has ever had a chance to actually use the autonomous lift vehicles in Las Vegas. There were about 20 or so operating the last time I was there, and we did our best to try to get one, but we had no luck because there are obviously hundreds and probably more like a thousand Lyft and Uber vehicles roaming the streets of Las Vegas, and you can keep on trying to get an autonomous one, but you might not succeed. We didn't have any luck that day. And then at the bottom, you see a vehicle by a company called Neuro, which is making a freight delivery. I mentioned before, and I want to kind of drive it home here, that there is a lot of preemption and there are multiple layers of AV policy. By preemption, I just mean that local agencies cannot do certain sorts of things in most states. They can't do most sorts of regulation. So starting with this, the U.S. Department of Transportation maintains oversight over the design, construction, and performance of motor vehicles, including their safety aspects. So local cities aren't actually allowed to regulate safety aspects of a vehicle. So they can't say that they want to have special rules for their locality. That's just not allowed. The federal government preempts that. States have also regulated autonomous vehicles in different ways. And one of those has been that there can be rules about whether or not cities are allowed to, permit or not permit the operation of AVs within their boundaries. So in the state of California, cities can't even be informed necessarily by a company whether the company is testing within their boundaries. There is no requirement for that. And in fact, most companies do not. They will just operate. And that's not true in Massachusetts. But other than Massachusetts, we haven't found another state that has delegated that responsibility to the municipal level. So cities therefore have to grapple with the state regulatory framework for AVs as they oversee pilots and as they craft AV policies. And since I'm not talking to a whole bunch of city planners here, let me just say that cities do have control over things like how their curbs are used. They do have control over how meters are charging. And this has been the interface between autonomous vehicles and also services like Uber and Lyft and cities to date for most cities. And that's a relatively limited interface. But there are also some other things that they can do on the land use policy side. So I'm going to be talking about those next. There is something called the AV START Act, which has not yet been passed, which I'm certain will be resurrected and still looked at under in the next administration, the federal administration. And this would essentially allow the federal government to issue permits to autonomous vehicle firms or manufacturers or whatever firm wants to operate services that would then be federally granted, and the states and municipalities would not have control over them. It's not clear whether or not this will end up passing the legislature, the US legislature, or not, but it is something that's in the works. Okay, so I want to talk about some AV testing and pilot examples. Our first example is the Las Vegas shuttle. This was a partnership between the city's innovation district, which is a sort of an interesting agency created for the purpose, essentially a promotion of the notion of innovation in the city of Las Vegas. The regional MPO, that's the Metropolitan Planning Organization, that is a regional level institution which has some level of control over planning for the future, essentially scenarios and plans that go forward a couple of decades. That's what the regional agencies do. And the local AAA, the American Automobile Association. And they ran shuttles that were kind of demonstration shuttles you can see this little this image there at the bottom. This is a relatively small shuttle. I believe these were 6-person shuttles. They weren't operating at the time that we did our visit because they had been taken out of service by then. The city was involved in the route design, adjusting street traffic, adopting a sort of a signal phasing approach that helped with the shuttle's use. And then we're doing an evaluation of the shuttle afterwards. And it basically went from the convention center from the convention center and the main kind of gambling area in Las Vegas. They're talking now about doing in Las Vegas a shuttle that would actually be a bit more functional and maybe provide services that people would use, which would be a shuttle running between residential areas and some of the kind of medical cluster in Las Vegas, which a number of people do use. And so when we spoke with the woman who is in charge of the innovation, she's the chief innovation officer for the city of Las Vegas. She talked a lot about the value of this shuttle in promoting the city. So autonomous vehicles are seen by a lot of cities as a kind of economic development strategy, as a strategy to raise the profile of a city that would otherwise perhaps not be so well known. Now, Las Vegas is very, very well known as a city, but it's also trying to grow its business district and trying to attract industry. And to some extent, autonomous vehicles and the presence of autonomous vehicles is a signaling thing. It's something that says, hey, we're cutting edge and we have technology here too, and we're a good place to do business. So to some extent, that was happening in Texas. In Las Vegas. I'm anticipating my next case. Arlington, Texas is somewhat infamous as the largest city in the United States without public transportation services. So what they were talking about doing here is something that would foreshadow a autonomous substitute for public transportation services. And what they did is a couple of shuttles, 2 public shuttles that served a large sports campus and went to and from transportation and also were not in addition to providing this shuttle, we're providing a kind of a sedan-based version of a service, which we actually were able to try. And so this is the one time that I've only been in an autonomous vehicle once. It was here in Arlington, Texas. And the route design was managed by the city of Arlington. So the extent to which the private sector was in charge, in this case, it was a bit more public sector involvement and public sector funding. So this is part of the question here is how are autonomous shuttles going to be adopted, and are they going to require public subsidy? And currently they really are. This drive.ai pilot was a separate thing from the shuttle. This is the thing that I rode, and it is in a large office and entertainment complex, and the shuttle goes between the office and entertainment complex and another sort of downtown area. Both the pilots were pretty small in terms of the number of riders who actually use them, and the way that our contact at the city of Arlington described it was, quote, AVs are coming, and that's going to be our future. It is a benefit to us to make sure our citizenry are prepared for that and are experiencing it on a daily basis and are comfortable with it before there's an advent of that on a larger scale. So this city happens to be interested in it. There were vendors who were willing to try it out and to put their products sort of on display and for people to use them. But the number of people using the service was pretty small, as it was in Las Vegas. So we're seeing a theme here, which is that in this case, the testing for the public shuttles is we're not talking about large numbers of people being served so far. That just hasn't been the case quite yet. And then we have the example of testing and pilots in the private sector side, where it's more a question of, well, in this case, testing in the case of San Francisco, but something that's going on entirely in the private sector. There are multiple AV companies testing on city streets, including Cruise GM. Companies have to provide cities with, there's only one way that cities are involved. Cities have to be provided with instructions as to how their police are supposed to engage with the vehicles. What do the police do if they see an autonomous vehicle that is behaving erratically? How are they supposed to stop that vehicle, for example? So that's what the cities have to provide, have to be provided with. But other than that, the cities can't influence which roads AVs are tested on. They can't affect how large the vehicle fleets are, or even the law enforcement guidelines. So this is a quote that I'll read to you. The DMV requires a permit system. This is from Tilly Chang. She's the director of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. So she's the person at the highest level of transportation-related governance in the city of San Francisco. The DMV, that's the Department of Motor Vehicles, requires a permit system for testing and deployment. And in other words, it's the state level that has a permit system. One of the things that's required is a local law enforcement interaction plan to inform first responders how to interact with the vehicles when a driver is not present. So just so you know, some firms in some states now have permission to operate the vehicles without drivers completely. There's this kind of phased process that's happening in different states where the states say you can operate the vehicles, but you have to have a safety driver in them. And a couple of firms in California now have the ability to operate vehicles with no drivers in them. And it's when there's no drivers in them that the police have to figure out how to interact with these things if they see a problem. We lobbied hard to have a say in how first responders would interact with the vehicles, but the way that the regulations are written, the requirements of what must be included in the plan are vague, and there is no standard format which allows companies to write it on their own and submit it, potentially excluding critical pieces of information. So that's that's a couple of different little things here. That's there's the Department of Motor Vehicles, and then the big organization in California, which is in charge of regulating autonomous vehicles, is the California Public Utilities Commission. And the PUC has not been willing to share very much information with cities. Okay, and then there's the case in terms of AV testing and pilots of Boston. Massachusetts essentially allowed cities to decide where and whether autonomous vehicle firms could test. So within that framework, Boston agreed to allow A/B testing within so-called geofences, areas that were designated as being acceptable to test within. And the firms were required to demonstrate safe operation within each area before graduating to the next stage. And these are this is sort of a map of this little purple area is the first area where AV testing was allowed. And then after demonstrating competence there, the geofence was expanded to the entire Seaport neighborhood. That's the blue area. And then finally, one of the firms was allowed to test throughout Boston after passing its test, or passing the performance, the sort of performance evaluation that was done that agreed that it was doing well enough. So that firm is allowed to test throughout Boston. But when we were there, what we found was that they were only testing about 5 vehicles, and they were in the process of consolidating and being purchased. Autonomy was. And so, Boston is known as a particularly difficult place to test because of the fact that there's so much weather, and the streets are narrow, and Boston drivers. Let's not even talk about Boston drivers. So there's a lot of difficulty in terms of A/B testing, and this is one of the reasons why the firms wanted to test there. But it's also it creates difficulties in terms of the testing environment. So that's the quick Boston example. And I'm being cognizant of time. I want to get to the other set of findings. So I'll just mention that there's the New York situation where deployment was completely state controlled. The governor announced that autonomous vehicles would be tested in New York City in early 2018, but as this is a common thing that happens. I don't know if everyone pays attention to the state of New York and the city of New York. There's always a lot of tension between de Blasio and Cuomo, the governor and the mayor. And the mayor sort of put the kibosh on that and said, well, we have a lot of concerns about this. And as a result, the GM pilot that had been announced by the state was called into question by the city. And as a result, no testing had occurred in New York City. So it goes to show that the level of sort of support for testing does matter. And there happens to have been really strong support for testing in Arizona at the state level, despite the fact that there's been, that very well-known fatality that happened in Chandler. I'm going to skip over this slide, which is about goods movement. It's another interesting thing that's happening as well. This wasn't a major focus of our work, but there is a lot of testing going on, and there are rules. And this is where cities can play more of a role, because typically sidewalks are often used by autonomous freight vehicles. And as a result, cities are directly involved. When cities are trying to regulate road use, they're not allowed to regulate road use in the ways that they would like to, but they can regulate sidewalk use. So that has to some extent happened, but this has much less of a behavioral effect of the sort that I want to talk about later. So here's some lessons from the avian testing pilot part of the work. The publicly led AV shuttles are providing local agencies with control over planning, implementation, and evaluation. Public AV pilots, however, they often ended without clear plans for continuing the service. So it's still not clear that there's much of a market or a rationale for these shuttles. There aren't too many examples where the niche hasn't quite been found yet. And as I mentioned, private AV testing often occurs with local preemption. So there aren't very many formal options for influence, although cities, as in the New York case, can articulate that they're unwelcome there, and that may affect the willingness of cities of firms to test. All right, moving away from just testing and pilots to broader AV development at the local agency and regional level. There are different policy areas I'll mention, which I want to focus on here. There are different agency motivations. I alluded to this earlier when I mentioned the economic development motivation as one important motivation for cities to even regulate these things in the first place. Wanting, in other words, to attract AVs means you might want to adopt policies which are seen as friendly towards them. But there are a number of different policy areas that are important for cities to think about, that they're thinking about now. One of them is curb management. What are the rules for AVs or for TNCs like Uber and Lyft for them to use the curb? Because AVs, unlike passenger vehicles, to drop a passenger taxi, when it drops off a passenger, can get away with simply stopping in the middle of the street, opening a door and letting the passenger out, not necessarily pulling to the curb in every instance. That's unlikely to be permitted for autonomous vehicles for various reasons. And as a result, the use of the curb becomes much more important. And rules about the curb, therefore, will affect people's willingness to use the service itself, because it will affect the ability for you to get right where you're going, as opposed to maybe a couple of blocks away. So curb management is an important policy area. The question of smart infrastructure is an important issue as well. This refers to the idea that some versions of the autonomous vehicle future that people discuss are very focused on the need for sensors in the road and smart signals and that sort of thing to facilitate communication between infrastructure and vehicle, and also between vehicles as a means of enabling autonomy. And there are different views of this, and I suppose you probably talked about this in previous weeks. Some firms are talking about autonomy as being true autonomy that doesn't require the existence of such infrastructure. And that's been more the US approach. The European approach appears to be much more focused on providing smart infrastructure. Providing that infrastructure is important, is costly, and it's a sunk cost. And so it's a big issue for cities to be thinking about. Then there's integration with public transit, there's development, zoning, and parking, there's the question of taxes and road user charges, and there's the question of how regional planning is done. So given that, I think I have about 10 minutes left, right, honey? You're muted, but
yes, that is correct.
okay. So
8 minutes.
8 minutes.
Yes.
So what I'm going to do is I've already talked a little bit about these agency motivations, and so I'm going to skip over that part. And just to mention that there's another important area that some cities are dealing with, which is trying to address existing transportation issues. San Jose, California was an example of this. They had developed a request for information process to appraise potential AV deployment, which included available pilot areas, potential use cases, and data sharing opportunities. They don't possess any legal authority to regulate or manage AV testing, but they are inviting companies to try to come up with ideas, and they're trying to figure out how to use it to solve transportation problems, which is a different way than some cities are approaching it. So I'll just mention that policy areas that are important, I'm going to focus on two. One of them is curb management. High adoption rates of autonomous vehicles could require converting curb parking to pickup and drop-off zones, and we have an example of that now in some cities which have designated curb areas for pickup and drop-off for Uber and Lyft. In Phoenix, in one of our cases, Valley Metro provided Waymo with information on all available bus loading zones to provide them with a place. They said, you're allowed to use our bus loading zones as long as there's not a bus there. And you can drop off and pick up there, because what they were doing was a pilot study to show whether or not autonomous Waymo vehicles could be used to provide first and last mile services. In other words, as a means of extending the transit system. So this is an unusual example. And this is a quote from the former chief operating officer who we spoke with, Valley Metro. Parenthetically, autonomous vehicles could provide a much more cost-effective form of paratransit for people with disabilities. And this is something that's being tested as well in Phoenix and in Boston. Smart infrastructure, I mentioned this issue before about how there are different ways in which you can have these so-called smart roads. Then there's integration with public transit. I mentioned this just now, this first and last mile transport, that may extend to the agency's paratransit program. And I'm going to touch upon one last important policy topic, which is development, zoning, and parking. So there's one city, Chandler, in Arizona, that now allows developers to reduce off-street parking by 10% for each designated pickup and drop-off spot, up to 40%. And other interviewees have suggested tying a decrease in parking requirements to providing funds for an AV shuttle. Whereas we also spoke to some cities that said that they were worried that their elected officials were continuing to expand parking facilities. The question of how autonomous vehicles will allow people to reduce parking is a huge one. And it's huge because it has this potential to affect travel behavior, as I'll get to next. This is a quote from the principal planner in Chandler, Arizona, saying, if autonomous vehicles increase like we expect, and a lot of people use them in the future, not only can they reduce parking and create more of a pedestrian streetscape, because we're not going to have parking spaces in front of the buildings, but that presents opportunities for reuse of those huge parking lots that we have all over the city. Right now, when you just drive around the city, you'll see a shopping center and just a sea of parking around it. And in the future, that could change. So that's the idea. Maybe you've heard this idea. If you haven't, I'll introduce you to it. And that has the potential to change a lot about cities. And finally, there's this huge issue, which is taxes and road user charges. A lot of people are saying, look, with autonomous vehicles, you're going to need to have road user charges because of the fact that we should have them already. We should have people paying for their use of the roads. We don't have that, but with autonomous vehicles, the need for that is going to increase. there's this term zombie miles, which is used to refer, or deadhead miles, which is used to refer to the idea that autonomous vehicles might be driving around without a passenger, looking for their next passenger, or just driving around to avoid paying parking charges. So an example of this, San Francisco voters approved a new tax on all app-based ride-hailing services, for example, Uber and Lyft, and it includes a tax on AV services. This ordinance amending the Business and Tax Regulations Code and Administrative Code to impose an excise tax on the net rider fares for rides facilitated by commercial rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft, and rides provided by autonomous vehicles and private transit service vehicles. So this is a big deal, this area, this particular kind of policy area. I'll skip over this regional planning business, but there's a lot of scenario planning going on as well when it comes to autonomous vehicles in the United States. And that scenario planning is starting to affect what cities are seeing as possible future land use and transportation patterns. And the implications of that for planning are yet to be sort of understood very, very well. But okay, so some conclusions before I wrap up. Nearly all of our interviewees cited inadequate data sharing from autonomous vehicles. I didn't mention this, but this has been a huge issue that they're concerned about what their experience has been with Uber and Lyft, about not really knowing and understanding the extent of the services within their boundaries, and therefore not being able to regulate them very well. And there's a similar concern when it comes to autonomous vehicles, and this is a really kind of a big issue in terms of the ability to properly regulate. There are some policies that are being considered for adoption, which are probably going to provide benefits regardless of whether or not and how quickly autonomous vehicles are adopted. That's obviously a big question right now. How quickly are autonomous vehicles going to be actually on the road? And I think that's, from my perspective, you may know more than I do, but I don't have much reason to believe anything in particular about that question. I think it's very up in the air. But certain sorts of things, like parking reductions, are likely to have lots of value even without the autonomous vehicle advent, but others may not, including smart infrastructure. The lead-up planning time for autonomous vehicles is potentially quite large as a result of that uncertainty. Some behavioral implications, then I'll stop. So depending on the cost of autonomous vehicle services, which is a big question, how costly are they going to be? Does instrumenting a vehicle cost $30,000 per vehicle, or does it cost $5,000 per vehicle? If it costs $30,000 per vehicle, it seems less likely that you're going to have people buying their own autonomous vehicles, and more likely that they'll use them in fleets. And the cost will be shared in that way, and then that's a different story. But road user charges could significantly change the extent of the negative externalities of AV use, because they will affect the per trip charge and therefore the incentives for carpooling, which is a really important question for sustainability. Policies to reduce parking requirements adopted in conjunction with AV services have the potential, and this is a big question mark, to increase development density and to increase the use of alternative modes. But that's just a potential. We don't know for sure if that would happen, but we do know that without those sorts of policy responses, things like pricing and parking reductions, we don't have any strong reason to believe that AVs will not result in a substantial increase in road travel if their financial cost is sufficiently low. And I think I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Dan.